finish, I just wanted to briefly, we've got a very international audience here and speakers, so we thought it'd be really good to just situate a bit why Barcelona, why El Raval. And I'm very aware it's very much, my perspective that I will show, and I'm very aware that there's people like John Roca, who's the expert of this city, etc. here. So other people might help me if I get stuck. But our aims really for the workshop are really to think about the representation of the senses and power relations. And the only thing I want to say at the moment about power, what we mean with that is not just the imposition of power, but how relations are negotiated. So power is a form of negotiation, and that I think will be quite important tomorrow. But just, that is clear. And we want you to think about, how can the sensory responses be mediated and represented to a wide range of audiences, but also how can they be transferred across disciplines. So why Barcelona then? We chose 3 capital cities, London and a national capital city, Barcelona also a national city of Catalonia but regional within Spain, Köln a regional capital city, and Barcelona especially because of the its representation as a model of urban regeneration, a model of urban branding. It's in London, especially in Britain, it's heralded as the city that we should all aim to be. However, I hope people agree with me or might disagree, this model has also been questioned a lot, especially in the last 10 years. So during the Olympics, a lot of changes happened. Barcelona, from being a backwater city that nobody wanted to come to, more or less, everybody went to the beaches, Airport Beach. Now it has become a major tourist destination. And I was myself a bit surprised. I hadn't looked it up for a while. So we've moved basically from 1.7 million in the 1990s to almost 8 million last year. A huge increase of tourism in the city. And as Astrid pointed out yesterday, it's the first city where when you get to the airport, you have one sign to taxis and the other one to cruise ships. And that really, I've never noticed, and I thought, oh yeah. So that says a lot about what kind of destination it has also become. And it's really highly debated, especially locally, how to cope with this influx of tourism. Also, the other influx that people often don't talk about, and especially in my teaching, I say we have to think of both. It's not just influx of tourism, but also of migration in general. So again, Barcelona has had a huge influx of non-European migration. I think it's always been, and I'm probably an example, I was born here by German parents, and it's always been a very international city, but it's had, since the 2000 more or less, since Barcelona's Spain's boom, there's been a huge influx of international migration as well. So there are really the challenges for planning, for living in this city. So why El Raval then? For me, El Raval encapsulates really all these changes in a very explicit way, and I think especially the CCTV is also an example of this process. So Raval can be, I think, understood, the redevelopment of the El Raval can be understood through the senses, and that's why I briefly, for 5 minutes, talk you through. So we're focusing tomorrow our field work on the Calle Hospital, and there's a reason for that. Judith and I both thought which street is very representative and important in this neighborhood. And the Carrera Hospital basically divides El Raval into 2. It's an old Roman road, so very historical road. And also, it was therefore one of the first roads in this neighborhood. But also, it is a frontier for a lot of people. It divides El Raval to the north and to the south. And I now address a bit my interpretation from a sensory point why that is and what has happened. So El Raval developed in the outskirts of the medieval city. A lot of people aren't aware that Barcelona's walls were there till 1859. 56. Yeah, very recently, 59, 56. And El Raval grew within 2 city walls, so it was always a very dense area. First agricultural area, and then it became an industrial area during the Industrial Revolution. Also with a lot of industrial working class housing and very densely built. It was at one point one of the most dense neighborhoods of Europe, actually. And also El Raval, because the main city was the Gothic quarter, Raval had all the businesses or the venues that the main city didn't want. The orphanages, the hospitals, any businesses that smelled, etc. Classical story we have also in the East End, Alex, yes. So very similar to Whitechapel that we looked at in London, and I think Eigelstein as well. And then El Raval, the city walls fell, in 1859, and Cerdà created the Eixample, the famous Barcelona block system around it. But he tried out, interestingly enough, his first Eixample block was in El Raval, in this northern part. So we can see that tomorrow. So already the northern part of the Raval had a much more, bourgeois, started to have a bit more bourgeois housing. It had the main hospitals here. The south of the Raval was just industry and working class housing, and carried on being that. So when the walls fell, El Raval got hidden behind what's been called here panel housing. So when you walk around El Raval, the main roads still now, the Ramblas, Via La Yetagna, the other ones here, they hide behind the high walls, this working class neighborhood. And I would argue that that's been done consciously to hide the sensuous life of the neighborhood. Like I said, densely lived, very lively street life, loud neighborhood. Also, the south of Raval became infamously famous for being the red light district, El Barrio Chino. So a bohemian neighborhood, a neighborhood that captured writers' imaginations, Jean Genet, etc. And sensuously they evoked this neighborhood. And it was almost like a two-way system between the bohemian artists and the physical infrastructure that created this real bohemian and folkloric place almost, where people always came to, especially men, because of the prostitution, the harbor, etc. But that really captured the imagination of a lot of people. So it always stood in opposition to the bourgeois Barcelona. And that's also interesting politically, because the first, I think from what I've read, the main anarchist movement started in El Raval. So again, it was easy to hide here. Again, the sensual structure of the place, the material landscape, people could hide, run away from the police, etc. All that helped to create also this kind of anarchist, libertarian kind of character of this neighborhood. And then what happened after the Civil War is, of course, complete repression of all that with the Franco regime. And these are actually some of the classical images by some of the photographers that capture this kind of bohemian feel, nostalgic. At the same time, it's important to say it was the poorest neighborhood, and people lived in awful conditions here. It was also famous for what's been called barraquismo vertical, vertical shacks on top of the roofs, which you're a bit hidden now, but you can still see around. So at one point there were 1,000 people per hectare living in El Raval, so extremely, extremely dense. Then repression, like I said, it fell into abandonment more or less, but not really after the 1940s, 50s, meaning that the brothels, etc., went more underground, but they still were there, of course. But it wasn't as bohemian anymore. It started especially in the 1960s. A lot of people left El Raval, the inhabitants. And that's something I always point out, that you need to remember. This was also a lived neighborhood. A lot of working class people lived here, but also lower middle class people, and all that worked alongside everything else that was happening. That also, 60,000 people left in the 1960s with the Spanish boom. So everybody that could left El Raval towards the Eixample, the more middle class areas of the city. And those people that stayed had a very strong place attachment to El Raval. There's a very strong, or used to be a very strong community feel, often, evoked as the golden times. And again, sensuously reflected in that, you could see people talking to each other constantly on the street. And Raval is still the only place nowadays, I think, where I can see, well, maybe in Sants as well, and some other neighborhoods, where you have chairs in a shop, so people can sit down and have a chat. You don't get that in the Eixample, for example, yeah? So it's also a very strong, tight community. But also in terms of bands going around the streets, playing music, etc., all that created a sensuous community in Raval as well. And then in the 1980s, the regeneration started to be talked about, and the Olympics really then pushed it forward. And like you can see, it was very much about looking towards Europe. Ciudad Bella towards Europe. And this is the Rambla del Raval, which cut through the main prostitution areas and demolished those, for example. And we can see that tomorrow. And there was, again, a divide between South and North. North had a cultural regeneration, and the South had a social regeneration going on. And I'll cut now a bit shorter, but so I've talked in my book about that, how this cultural regeneration happened, by really working also on the sensory feel of the place. It was very much about cleansing, homogenizing, in my view, some of the areas of El Raval, and really creating new public spaces for new middle class to come in, mainly in the north of the neighborhood where we are now, in the cultural area. Museums, university next door, classical cultural regeneration. And like I said, the south had the Rambla del Raval cutting through it, and now it has a film house, a Filmoteca, hoping again to attract people next to the main prostitution street nowadays as well. And it's a real place of contrast. And then what I always argue is that you still have, despite of all this, some things not happening as expected. Or maybe, I think now the planning has also changed. People don't want it to expect now. It hasn't been regenerated completely. It isn't gentrified. And that is because of partly a huge influx, not just of migrants, and again the numbers I think show what's going on in terms of how quick it happens. So 1998, 15% in Raval inhabitants, 15% were migrants, and by now it's around 14.8%. So all that happened very quickly in a very short time. So what is then interesting is that you have, of course, many improvements in terms of community facilities, housing rehabilitation. However, the south of Raval still has the highest mortality rates in Barcelona. Yeah, the Carrer Hospital down is a different world in the back streets, not on the main Rambla, of course. So it's the mortality rate is 43% higher than in the rest of Barcelona due to tuberculosis, etc., etc. So that's one of the background information. But also, what a lot of people then don't talk about is this extra-European migration, but also called Erasmus students, etc. They're also coming all in to El Raval. It's a very bohemian, trendy, sexy neighborhood, and all that is changing the neighborhood in very unexpected ways. So you have the classical Pakistani shops next to gentrifying boutiques, now a real mix of sensory impacts on the street and facing you all the day. So just to finish then, so all these changes were quite hard for a lot of the local inhabitants. There are, of course, a lot of them dying now, or have been dying, in the last few years. But I think, again, the senses are very important when you talk to people and ask them about how has El Raval changed. And a lot of the discourses are, about how it was a village before, and now I feel for it in my own world. And it's quite interesting how kind of some of them racist discourses are framed through the sensory. And that's again why we thought looking at power will be interesting. But as I keep saying, not just migrants, but also tourists. People feel overwhelmed by tourists here as well. And again, it's very much often a sensory discourse because they drink, they do their necessities on the street, etc., etc. You know, that's, again, a very sensuously polluting kind of discourse that comes up a lot. And then lastly, there's been then a real interesting campaign, I think, that started in 2004 about the city council, the shopping, you know, the people here, the locals, have become very aware how trendy El Raval has become internationally. It's seen as some of the most bohemian neighborhoods now in Europe. Apparently there are more than 50 nationalities living within. And again, think how dense this is. You can cross El Raval in 15 minutes, yeah? Very dense neighborhood. So there was a campaign that started in 2004 that again captured the sensory through its branding in terms of saying, let's ravalejar here. Let's go around El Raval and become part of it by digesting its public life. I can be part of this bohemian feel by being, you know, eating, drinking, sensing the life here. Of course, I'm a bit cynical about it because we don't sense, you know, the flats where 20 immigrants have to change beds every 8 hours, etc. You know, we can, a lot of these, the middle class people that are part of this, you know, can go into their trendy clubs or bars and you don't have to sense all the different aspects of the neighborhood. So we've really moved then from the tourist gaze that John Arry talked about to a much more holistic tourist experience where the senses are now used to market El Raval and I think also Barcelona overall. And that somebody like David House calls the sensual logic of capitalism. So the argument is there's a visual fatigue amongst us, and what we need now is really the other senses to revitalize this tiredness that we have of what we know already. And that's what, you know, the senses, the other senses, and also provide. So for me, El Raval exemplifies, therefore, all the contradictions that you get, you know, of revitalizing or replanning a neighborhood. It hasn't gone to plan, and diverse social groups appropriate the spaces in very different ways, and imposing an array of sensory meanings and uses. And for me, it's also what a lot of people talk about here when you talk to an urban laboratory. Yeah, maybe we can learn from El Raval about how we need to reframe urban citizenship. You know, because despite all the issues, problems, and you know, it is more. I mean, I don't want to be nostalgic or anything or romanticize it, but it's somehow working to an extent. This neighborhood, there aren't too many clashes between the different groups yet, etc., etc. So, just then to finish, I think, you know, being here, I'm really, you know, proud, happy to work with the CCTV, but also to be in a Raval and to really focus on the senses that maybe offer us a new way to understand the city and the more subtler politics that happen in everyday life.